Hello and good evening, everyone. My name is Daniel Murdoch, and I've chosen to review this article, Climate Change and Coastal Environmental Risk Perceptions in Florida. As a Floridian, I have a particular interest in the conservation and mitigation efforts put forth by state regulators. However, the actions taken are merely a representation of public perception in a democratic climate, and as such, environmental risk perceptions are critical to the advancement of climate-forward policies and initiatives as a precursor to institutional controls. Although this article is 8 years old, I believe that its findings are relevant to today's context and the subject matter is within our course's scope. This is your standard outline. We'll be going over the overarching goal, data, methods, and study, results and discussions, conclusions, and my thoughts and reflections. The overarching goal includes the understanding of public perception and climate change risks is a prerequisite for the effect on climate communication adaptation. Reaching a consensus in the court of public opinion can be challenging, but for the purposes of this study, 17 different parameters were presented to a sample group of 762 undergraduates at the University of Florida. The researchers opted to focus on physical environmental risks rather than other factors such as socioeconomic ones, as a more salient option given the sample group demographic to assess personal beliefs and individual attitudes. The study is an effort to further the understanding of what drives climate risk perception and helps to make suggestions on what might improve future climate outreach and communication. Respondents were asked to rate their level of concern about 17 coastal environmental risks. The questions were formulated by a multidisciplinary panel of specialists at the Florida Sea Grant and the technical staff in the coastal community of Cristobal, Florida. Using the most to least rating system, respondents were presented with a list and asked to rate each of the items on a 10-point rating scale. The parameters chosen included social trust, environmental attitudes, risk salience, demographic variables, and a regressional analysis. Social trust was measured using several questions based on trust within Florida government officials. Environmental attitudes were measured using a 15-question new ecological paradigm scale. Risk salience was used as a key prior coastal environmental risk event in light of the recent hurricane season of 2004, which brought Hurricane Charlie, Francis, Ivan, and Jean in the same year. The level of effect was an important factor in the respondents' level of risk salience. Demographic variables such as age, income, gender, ethnicity, and political affiliation were also noted. A regression analysis for each of the risk factor components were used to create a residual plot for visual inspection and inferred variance structure. The 17 risk items are shown in the table to the left, showing what the sample group deemed to be the most concerning in regards to coastal climate change impacts, as seen through their level of personal effect. The overall mean score for the risk items was 6.75, with the highest items of concern being drinking water loss, property damage from hurricanes, and water contamination. The regression model indicated that the NEP, or New Ecological Paradigm Score, was the strongest predictor of physical environmental risk perception, with the respondents expressing greater environmental concern and also perceiving greater risk. It's worth noting that individuals' cognitive and affective characteristics often influence their environmental risk perceptions as much or more than the characteristics of the risks themselves. There are apparent similarities amongst some of the most highly rated risks. For example, water risks and property damage from hurricanes are together 2 of the 6 hazards that are rated over 7. These concerns might be considered more immediate personal threats to the respondents, especially compared to the items of least concern, such as tourism declines, the spread of invasive species, and aquatic terrestrial plant population declines. This study confirms prior findings in risk analysis literature that risk perception is primarily influenced by cognitive and affective processes, and that risk characteristics alone are insufficient to explain risk perception. The study showed that people use experiential processing when perceiving risks, which relies on metaphors, stories, and images. Climate-forward advocates should consider using these devices to forward institutional agendas that would promote climate change-centric policies. Furthermore, this study shows that in conjunction with the regression model, that climate change is not perceived as a single risk and that people responded differently to the relatively homogeneous factors presented in the risk perception questionnaire. It could be useful to craft messages based on the salient concerns within a coastal Floridian context, and this approach could serve other regions within the country as well. The past several years of my professional life has been in the environmental due diligence industry, working closely with agencies like the FDEP, the Florida Department of Environmental Protection. Unfortunately, somewhat of a regime change took place in the early 90s, where most of the environmental scientists were ousted and the administration was overhauled in favor of staff that would support economic development. This resulted in a reduction of state-mandated soil and groundwater cleanup target levels. This is just an example or an indication of a general unwillingness to promote progressive regulations, with the apparent mood leaning towards maintaining the status quo. Driving risk perceptions from the next generation is paramount, as the inevitability of climate change encroaches upon our daily lives, with sea surface rising temperatures, extreme weather events, drought, and drinking water contamination dependent on the level of public response. That I believe that the results gained from the study can gauge areas of concern that would resonate with voters and help mitigate some of the negative effects of climate change in an area like Florida, that prides itself on biodiversity and a generous coastline. Protecting Florida's natural assets should be given the same level of ethical consideration, and perhaps a different approach could spur preventative climate change policies instead of relying on mitigative reactionary ones. And that's all. Thank you. If you have any questions or you just want to talk about Florida, feel free to send me a message or email me within Canvas.